Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a non-spoiler overall thoughts for Netflix's Witcher Blood Origin. If you don't know, Blood Origin is supposed to take place in the past, so it doesn't actually really involve any of the main characters from the main series on Netflix. The only exception to that is Jaskier, or Dandelion, however you prefer to think of him. He is somebody who, in the very beginning, he is being told about this story that eventually unfolds through the rest of the 4 episodes. So one of my biggest frustrations with this is that there was so much potential to do so many amazing things here. Not that you should feel restrained by an adaptation because you are literally adapting source material. That's the whole point, is that you're taking something and then you're putting it in a different medium. But I was curious to see what the writers were going to do when they didn't have to be held to certain plot points. They had very little that they have as far as lore that is within Sapkowski's books. And so they could do so much with it. And I think my first point that I was frustrated with was how rushed this was. So there was a story there. There was a potentially really good story there. But how quickly we would progress through scenes, how quickly we would introduce new characters, how quickly their dialogue with each other would occur, made it so that anything that I actually was invested in or gripped by, it's like I didn't have time to really be fully gripped by it. My interest would be piqued and then we'd be on to the next thing. Their dialogue goes so quickly that I actually paused it and I turned to my husband. I was like, I feel like I'm watching a YouTube video, because a lot of times in making YouTube videos, people will cut out any unnecessary fluff because the point is either to entertain or inform, and to do so in a very quick amount of time or in a way that is succinct. And in this particular setting, in having something that is a story that should be fleshed out, that you're getting to know these characters and this world, you want the conversations to feel organic. You want it to feel like people are actually talking to each other and that they hear what the other person says, and then what I would expect to take place is that the person would kind of think about it. They would think about everything that they've learned, everything that's going on, and then they would reflect on that information and the information of what the person just said, and then they would reply. And instead it was like rapid fire, you say your line, I say my line, you say your line, I say my line. And that is what the entire 4 episodes kind of felt like. It didn't really feel like we had room to breathe. There were a couple of moments in the mini-series where they would take time, and those were so much better. The actors actually got to act in those moments. The second point, somewhat tying to this, is it feels like there were missing pieces. It felt like there was potentially, I said this before, there was potentially a really good story there. So if you don't know, the idea is that we are looking at this elven kingdom, and there is a political figure who she has certain visions for what she wants out of life. She does not want to just be married off. She wants to really take not only her own life to a greater degree and not only leave behind a legacy and be remembered, but she also wants to sort of carry her kingdom into, I guess you could say, almost like the new century. She wants to be the one to cultivate innovation and move things forward. And how she wants to go about that is not great as far as morals go, but I'll touch on her a little bit more later. But the idea is that a lot of the people in the lower classes have not really been considered. They've been mistreated. They're starving. They're hungry. And our 2 main characters are people who were higher ranked, and so they weren't necessarily affected by those things as much, but they have somewhat been cast out of their clans, and so the expectation is that they then end up seeing the struggles of the common people. And the reason I say it felt like there was missing pieces is because when you're first introduced to our main leads, they're already kind of in their cast out situations for the most part. One of them, you see the casting out. The other one, you just know that she's no longer really a part of her clan, and they both have their history. And then you don't really get then their major backstories, seeing the distance, seeing everything, the connections they had with people before, how much they miss people from before. You don't really see that all that much. And on top of that, you really don't see One, them interacting with the common people, you could say, the people who have been mistreated for years and years and years. You don't really see their interactions much. And on top of that, you get no perspective, really, at all for the common people who play a role in the politics and especially play a role in some major events that happen in the last episode. And so it kind of felt like we're gearing up for some kind of uprising from a group of people whose motivations we never really get to see, or we don't really get to see in an intimate way in which you as the viewer then connect and you're like, yes, we got to take down that political figure. We need to eliminate them and put someone else. You don't really have those feelings because you never really see anybody in those positions. So in that way, it felt like that's what I mean by it felt like there was a potentially really good story there. I think a lot of us really enjoy any kind of a story about a mistreated class of people rising up to demand what they deserve, to demand that they be treated with dignity as human beings, that they aren't mistreated, that they aren't worked to death, to further the riches of the higher classes. I think a lot of us can get on board with that kind of a plot, but when you don't have anyone from that perspective and your main characters aren't really interacting with people from those perspectives, it ends up not really making you as the viewer feel all that invested or connected. I said a minute ago that I would get to that one particular character. I think her name was pronounced Merwin. Merwin was probably my favorite part of the show as far as not being cliche. So my fourth point that I'll get to is that the show was incredibly cliche, sadly. But Merwin was not. Merwin was interesting, and I don't think she was utilized. I don't think her character and her plot line was given the time it deserved, because if this had been a lot longer, if it had been more episodes or even more seasons, I think this could have been fantastic. And I think Merwin could have been almost like a Cersei Lannister type of character. She refuses to let herself be a footnote. What she's willing to do for her vision and the way in which her principles are somewhat twisted, she was a fascinating character to follow. She is villainous, but at the same time, you kind of, I don't want to say I hope nobody's like, I relate to her necessarily, because she is pretty awful and she's willing to do awful things, but she was interesting. And I think a lot of us are absolutely willing to follow a villainous character when they are interesting, when you dive into them and you're getting into their motivations and why they're doing what they're doing. And I thought that she was done well. I just kind of going back to point one, it was a little rushed because we didn't get enough time with her. I do also think that the makeup artists and the costume designers really got to flex when it came to her character, because the different looks that they gave her and the different outfits that they gave her were, I thought, genuinely really interesting. I mean, they were creative, they were different, they didn't quite look like any other things I'd seen before, and the choice of where to place things, like, I mean, there's one look where she's got stuff going along her forehead, and the clothing and the way they do her hair, that was another thing too. I was glad, at least for everybody involved with the presentation of that character, that it seemed like got to have a lot of fun. They got a lot of freedom to be creative. The fourth point, I went from a good thing and then going to something a little bit more negative in nature. This was very cliche. Now, this can be a positive for some people in that some people kind of miss that Xena Princess Warrior feeling of science fiction and fantasy shows, and so they kind of like the cheesy factor to some degree. And there are times when it can be kind of fun. There's times where it bleeds more into campiness rather than being cliche. But for me, it leaned too much into cliche. So, for example, the dialogue, you have... So, dialogue and character types are not anything new. And you get dialogue between characters that you almost feel like you could play another movie or another show, and the scenes would play out basically exactly the same. And there's a part where the wise mentor-like character is purposefully egging one of them on to prove that they let their emotions get in the way, and that when they do and they're that angry, then they're not as good of a fighter and they're not working as a team, and they need to learn to control themselves so they can work as a team. And we've all seen that before so many times, and I'm not opposed to seeing these same kinds of, I guess you could say, tropes, to put it in a nicer way. I'm not opposed to seeing that in stories, but you need that room to breathe, you need that substance, and you need the characters to come to life for me to be sold on those more cliche moments. I think, sorry, I'm a big fan of Arcane. So to compare it to something like Arcane does some things that are pretty unoriginal. Some of the aspects of Arcane are not all that new, but the way the characters were done and that room to breathe, the depth that the characters have, the fact that you do get some of that backstory and you expand on that and you understand why they are the way they are and you feel for them and you just wish that the world could be on pause so that they have time to take care of themselves, but they don't. All of those feelings that you have makes it so that you don't mind when there's maybe something a little more cliche. And in this, there was not the time. So the cliche moments it just felt like it. I wouldn't even necessarily say that it felt distinctly like Witcher even. It just felt like any sci-fi fantasy show. The last point, and kind of ending on more of a positive, I did like some of the action in this. I am more of a character-focused reader, viewer, gamer. I care more about stories. Action always ends up coming second to me because while I can appreciate an amazing action scene, I usually want to care about whoever is in that action scene because then it kind of that's what makes you go on the edge of your seat. And in this case, the action scenes, I was usually not too worried about anybody, and not that there weren't stakes, because there were stakes in this, and there were people that were surprisingly harmed, we'll say, in this show, but the action, I still wish we would have had more connection so that I cared more about what was happening during the action scenes, but the choreography and some of the originality actually came through in the action scenes. There's a whole fight scene in this dwarven bank that I thought was well done. There's also an action scene earlier on that could have bled into cliche territory, but I actually feel like the way the camera, of course you're going to get times where the camera angle changes, but the way the camera angle kind of followed a character, I really liked, and I think that it reminded me a little bit of season 1 of Witcher with that one action scene that a lot of us really like. So I do think that the action was pretty good, and whoever the choreographer was for it, I thought did a good job. Overall, I didn't hate this. I didn't love it. I didn't think it was anything special. I will say I was pretty ready to not keep going after the first episode. I really thought the first episode was quite weak, and I think I was a little bit more sold after the next couple of episodes, but it was still not anything that I would praise. It's definitely not that. I am curious your thoughts about Witcher Blood Origin. What did you think of it? What were the pros and cons for you? I am going to be doing an in-depth discussion for this with some other people. So if you'd like to see spoilers, if you want to see a spoiler discussion, be on the lookout for that. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.